We are today with Dr. Attila Hancıoğlu. Dr. Hancıoğlu is the chief of the Data Collection Unit's Data and Analytics Section at UNICEF Headquarters in New York. He is the coordinator of the Global Multiple Indicator Cluster Surveys program, often abbreviated as MIC surveys. We are proud to say he is a demographer and has a PhD from the Hacettepe University Institute of Population Studies. Today, we will ask him questions about his mixed experience regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. Mixed surveys have been around for about 25 years, with data collected in more than 100 countries. These surveys produce key statistics primarily on children and women and households. The COVID-19 pandemic has become a major obstacle to face-to-face interviewing around the world. We had a chance to see different parts of the world coping with different challenges in terms of surveys, as well as different types of surveys coping with different challenges. To start off, Dr. Hancıoğlu, can you tell us the state of mixed surveys around March when the pandemic was declared? Were there any countries in the field? Were there any countries getting ready for the field?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm really pleased to be speaking to you today. Well, let me come from the context. Put this all into a context. In this round of mix, which has been running since 2017 and will end of next year, 2021, we have had an unprecedented number of surveys joining the program. At that point, let's talk about March. In March, we had 71 surveys in the program, having joined the program from about 58, 59 countries, I think. Some countries happen to do more than one survey in a round, like, for instance, Pakistan, which has provincial level surveys. So there's a separate survey for Punjab, there's a separate survey for Sindh, etc. That's why the number of surveys and the number of countries is different. So we had 71 surveys at the time, and out of those 71 surveys, we had 7 of them who were in the field as COVID came in and the restrictions were imposed worldwide. Of course, as you know, which is still the case, I think, the type of restrictions and the intensity of restrictions is quite different from one country to the other. However, there were 7 surveys who were in the field. A large number of surveys had already been completed. Either they were published or they were about to be published or analyzed post data collection, let's say. And we had a number of countries who were at the design and planning stages. And furthermore, we had about 5 or 6 countries who were about to go to the field. They were either training the field workers or they were just doing the logistics, the last minute logistics, etc. So of those 7 surveys, which were in the field, we quickly did an assessment of where they stand. We immediately suspended. We recommended to the countries to suspend the fieldwork in 7 countries, which they did. And then we started an assessment to see how much of fieldwork had been completed. Remember, at the time, this is March and April we are talking about, there's still uncertainty as to the trajectory of the pandemic. At the very early days, I remember mid-March or early March when this came in, at least to the US, then we started thinking maybe this is another emergency which will happen and then will go away. We will go back to normal. That was the mind frame of the whole world, I think, at that point. We didn't really understand the extent and depth of this pandemic. Now it is a whole different story, of course. So of those 7 surveys, we assessed quickly in April, I think this is happening. We assessed where they stood, how much of fieldwork they had completed, whether we could call them finished even. And we found out that out of those 7, 5 had really gone all the way up to 95% completion of fieldwork. So there was just a few clusters remaining. So we considered those surveys completed. We did some work to recalculate sample weights, to see the distribution of the clusters which are completed and incomplete. And of those five surveys were considered complete at that point, and we moved them to data processing, data analysis and editing, and reporting. And I think all of them by now have been, most of them have been published by now. There were two surveys which were not near completion at all. One was Malawi, and the other one was Turks and Caicos. They had completed 50, 60, 70% of the fieldwork. So it was not possible to consider them complete. And that had to do with that had to do with the way that they had completed what they had completed up to that point, which was not a good geographic distribution. So there was no way that we could come up with sample weights which would compensate for that incompletion. Those two surveys, by the way, in June, July, they went back to the field, they resumed fieldwork, and they completed the fieldwork. The other five surveys, four of them were above 90% completion. One of them was around 60%. That's Argentina. But when we looked at the distribution, it looked good. The way that they had planned the fieldwork, the logistics of the fieldwork, how they would move from one area of the country to the other, it allowed us to say we can actually do some analysis, look at the sample weights, recalculate sample weights, and try to see if we can really complete the survey without going to the field again, and we did. And the Argentina survey is about to be published now, I think. So that's what happened more or less with the fieldwork going on at the time of the COVID.
I wonder what was the response to countries for which preparations were underway. I mean, you talked about it, but have there been any mode switch or cancellation?
I don't think any survey has been cancelled because of COVID. There's a couple of surveys that have been cancelled since then, but that has nothing to do with COVID, actually. Those were two surveys which were really uncertain to a large extent because of internal problems in the countries. So with the exception of those two surveys, I don't think we have any cancellations. But there's a lot of postponement, of course, because what we did was we first temporarily suspended all the face-to-face activities in all the countries. Then we thought, let's see what we can put in place to continue or even accelerate some of the other activities, which normally depend on face-to-face interaction, but can be maybe completed in alternate ways. For instance, workshops or data interpretation workshops or meetings, steering committee meetings, technical committee meetings, the actual technical support that we provide to the countries, which happens both on-site and off-site. How much of it can we do off-site? Can we continue to support countries on data processing from afar without going to the country? And one of the things that we thought at the time was to really use this as an opportunity to accelerate progress. Not progress on fieldwork, of course, because fieldwork was suspended, but especially for those countries who had completed fieldwork, then let's try to accelerate the editing of the data, the analysis of the data, and the writing of the reports, which we have had partial success in, I would say, not 100% success, because we didn't also foresee in all its clarity at the time how much of these restrictions would really put the burden on the national statistical offices, on our counterparts. In some countries, for instance, there was complete lockdowns for a long period. The staff members were not equipped or were not prepared to work from home, to continue working on data, for instance. So that delayed quite a number of things. But otherwise, I think our approach has been, let's suspend face-to-face activities, but anything which is not face-to-face, let's try to accelerate them as much as possible virtually. And we have been doing things that we never did before. For instance, we have this data interpretation and report compilation workshops, which happens in every country after we collect the data and analyze the data. That's in preparation for the writing of the report, the final report. And that has been done in a number of countries virtually with our virtual participation. And that has had, I think, limited. It's not the real thing, as you would imagine, but I think it has been really good. We have been able to make progress on those.
Thank you. We have been hearing about Mix Plus, or the Mix Plus Real-Time Monitoring Survey. We read on the Mix website that this project was launched in 2018, and it involves phone interviews. Can you tell us about this initiative, please?
Sure. That's something that I'm really involved with personally as well, at this point, quite intensely. Well, Mix Plus, let me go back a couple of years. In 2018, what you said is right. We started thinking about the project and putting it in place and doing some activities in relation to that in 2018. The idea goes way back, way before 2018, actually. I remember in 2013 or 14, I think, as far back as that, we started to think about this on how we can use phones in one way or another, and I will come to that in a minute, to collect data. We didn't go that far. Just when we were putting in place a more systematic idea of doing this, then we realized that the World Bank had been doing similar surveys in a number of countries. They were mostly piloted in Latin American countries, then they moved to a few African countries. And back in 2018, they were doing 2 surveys, I think, in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, with methodology which is similar to what we have in Mix Plus now, which is basically as follows. This is the World Bank version of it. Commission a survey, a household survey, collect background information, collect phone numbers, ask for consent, and then immediately after the household survey is completed, start calling the same as a subsample or all of the households which have been interviewed during the household survey for an extended period. And for Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, this has been going on at least for 2 years, I think, in the case of World Bank. So we realized that was happening, and we developed a dialogue with the World Bank. We tried to learn as much as possible from them, and then we put Mix Plus in place. The first step was back in 2019. I think it was early 2019. We started a collaboration with the Belizean country office of UNICEF and the National Statistical Office, and we started to pilot Mix Plus in Belize. We first did a household survey in 2 districts of Belize. That was a pilot, that wasn't national. 2 pilots in 2 districts. And then we included all of those households who gave us consents and phone numbers into the Mix Plus, and we started calling them. We worked with a private vendor at that point for the setup of the call center. We trained the interviewers, the NSO trained the interviewers, and we started the calls. And interestingly, from the beginning, and this is something slightly different from the World Bank main objectives, I would think, one of the objectives of Mix Plus was emergency monitoring. We were actually at the same time looking for countries who are prone to emergencies, like hurricanes and floods and that kind of thing. We thought that Mix Plus could be a great vehicle if we had it in place, running, and when an emergency comes in, then you have a representative sample of phone numbers that you can call, and you can get an immediate response from the population to the emergency. So that was one of our objectives from the beginning. Then COVID came in March. And in April, I think it was, if not March, if not May, the government of Belize declared a state of emergency, and several restrictions were put in place. And we immediately reacted with MixPlus, and we immediately started to collect data on COVID attitudes, behavior, etc. So it was, an unexpected gift in a way to MixPlus. And then we started collecting the COVID-related data, and we ended it several months ago. We ended up with 11 waves of calls, 11 monthly sets of calls. And at that point, we started, because COVID was in, restrictions were in, then we started thinking of doing it in other countries. And right now we have it running in Mongolia. We have finished the first round of calls. We're about to start the second round of calls. In Georgia, we have just finished piloting the main questionnaire for the first wave. We have the sample selected and everything else, of course, and we are about to start the first wave of calls. The methodology is as follows. Maybe let me go back to Mongolia and Georgia, because we have differences there. In the case, the methodology, the template of the methodology is as follows. You have to find a representative household frame and select, and that could be a mixed survey. That was our original intention. Or that could be any other representative frame of households. In the case of Mongolia, for instance, the frame that we are working with is the population registry. Interestingly, in Mongolia, the population registry, which was updated in February this year as part of the census, the online, the census that they were doing at that time, includes phone numbers. So but the mix in Mongolia was from 2018. So when we assessed which one would be the way to go, we concluded that it would be good to go with the population registry because the frame was more updated, etc. And we started doing the MixPlus based on the population registry. We selected a subsample and we started calling the households. In the case of Georgia, the sample frame is the mix from 2018, during which they had collected phone numbers. So that's what we're using. We have selected a subsample of households from the 2018 mix sample frame. And then that's what we're going to be doing. So the idea is, as I was saying, the template is start with a representative sample of households, start calling them over an extended period, give yourself the chance to change the questionnaires over time as well, and come up with longitudinal data based on the same households. So you do repeated calls for the same households every month. This opens up lots of opportunities. One is that your reaction time to what's been happening is really fast. Like in the case of Belize that I gave as an example, COVID came in and we were able to immediately start collecting data. We already had the frame, had the sample of households, etc. Second, you come up with longitudinal data with this approach. Third, you can actually look at seasonality or different indicators that the household surveys, cross-sectional household surveys usually suffer from. So there's a number of different advantages to this approach. And the whole thing is done by call centers. It's not web-based. It's not, it's not any other methodology, just call centers with real direct calls to the households by interviewers. That's basically what the methodology is. Oh, there's lots of complex details to it, of course, but maybe not appropriate to go into it at this point.
In countries where phone numbers have been collected or available from registers, what is the nature of this data? Are they usually landline or mobile? So, and if mobile phone information is provided by the respondents, to which household members do the phone numbers belong? It is usually the number for the head of household or the other household respondent or someone else. We'd like to learn some details about this, first of all, the type of the phone and the owner.
Well, nowadays it's predominantly mobile phones. I think landline phones are a thing of the past in almost all the countries. In many African countries, for instance, the landline concept is not there at all. But mobile phones are very, very common. Having said that, of course, there's lots of countries, many countries now, which have above 90% ownership of mobile phones, or at least one member in the household. There are still countries who are at the 50% mark, 50%, 60%. And we actually, we know this from the statistics, of course, including from mix, several mix surveys, in which case we do not only know the extent of ownership or use of mobile phones, but we also know which groups are not using and which groups are using, which is very useful methodologically, of course. So it's predominantly mobile phones. Everybody has mobile phones now. It's the extent and use of mobile phones is just extraordinary, and I think it has grown exponentially in the last few years. That's something that we have been taking advantage of. Not only us, but everybody else who are working in data collection field. Well, in the mix, for instance, let me give you an example from there. In the mix, we collect information on phone ownership and use in 3 different ways. One, in the household questionnaire that we have, we ask a question about whether anybody there's at least one person in the household who has a mobile phone. Then when we move to the individual questionnaires, the women's and men's questionnaires, both are for 15 to 49 years old, males and females. Then we ask about their individual use and ownership. One of the things that we have been detecting is that, especially for women, ownership and use are 2 different things. You ask whether they own a phone, you would get a percentage which would be significantly lower than their use. You ask a question whether they're using regularly a mobile phone, and they say yes. That's because most of the phones are owned by men or other people in the household. I don't think we have, at least from the mixed point of view, specific information on who owns or uses phones. But in terms of use, we do have it from the individual questionnaires, but it's not for all the household members. Now, when it comes to collecting phone numbers, of course, the standard practice is, and I think should be, because there are methodological reasons for it, should be to collect as many phone numbers from a household as possible, because there's a lot of changes that happen over time with mobile phone numbers, the area codes that vendors provide, the phone numbering system, that kind of thing, to be able to cope with those challenges. I think it's a good idea to collect more than one phone number per household. One thing maybe sort of in relation to your question is that in Belize, we had a split sample and we tested 2 approaches. One approach was to see over time, what would our attrition rates be if we were to call or target in a household any adult household member as the respondent. And in the other part of the sample, we targeted specific individuals in households. In the case of mix in Belize, it was women who are mothers or under 5s. We have been able to show through this pilot that targeting a specific individual would significantly increase attrition rates. Dropouts are much more common. To find people over successive months, the same person, is much more challenging, as you would imagine. than trying to go for any knowledgeable adult household member. Therefore, it is a good idea to connect as many phones as possible. And when you make those calls to the households, to get that individual, adult household member who can respond to your questions. So we have abandoned the idea in both the case of Georgia and Mongolia to do individual questionnaires like we do in Mix, like women's questionnaires that you guys have been doing in DHS, for instance. We don't do that in Mongolia and Georgia. We have the phone numbers, we have multiple phone numbers, we call those numbers, and we try to get hold of an adult household member that we can interview, who can give us proxy information on everybody else in the household, which has obvious an impact on what you can ask and what you can hope to ask and get good answers for, and the quality of data. So yeah, that brings another dimension of thinking into the content of what you do, the questions that you would ask. As you know, there are several issues and topics that you would only be able to get from the individual herself or himself. Let me give you an example from your DHS surveys, for instance, asking contraceptive questions on contraception to men about their wives, or a household head to a woman about a woman in the household would be unthinkable. So those kinds of questions, once you target any adult household member as your respondent, are completely out of question.
Speaking of the data collection with phone, how are the levels of providing phone number information by households? Would you expect any coverage bias due to the second round of frame preparation, where we are assuming the first frame is the address frame, which is open to some degree of coverage error?
I can probably talk more about the experience that we have had, and so far, I think in both cases, especially in Mongolia, for which we have concrete data now, because we have finished the first round of calls and we have gone, well into the process. The households do not seem to be reluctant at all to give phone numbers or accept our calls. Remember, in the case of Mongolia, the phone numbers are coming from the registry to the NS, to the National Statistical Office, who are the ones who are making the calls, not us, obviously. And I think the refusal rates are extremely low. I know a number of examples from other survey programs that the households, by far, in developing countries and most middle-income countries, do not hesitate to provide phone numbers to the interviewers during household surveys. There's consent issues there, of course. You have to approach the household in the right way, or the respondent in the right way, to get these questions. Ideally, you have to tell them exactly why you're collecting that information, etc. But I think if you do those right, in most countries, I don't think it's a big problem.
Thank you. So just to follow up on Yasser's question, what you mentioned was, as far as I understand, was the low level of not providing phone information. So what I understood was everyone pretty much provides this information, but how about the households that do not have any mobile phones at all? You mentioned you could see how different these households were because you already have mixed data from them before. So how about the differences between those that do not have phone information, that do not have phones actually, versus the other ones?
Yeah, well, it goes back to Yasser's question, actually, which I didn't respond to. I think the second part of his question about coverage bias. There's a number of countries. Well, let's think about this. If households who have mobile phones are quite okay to provide the phone numbers and participate in these phone surveys, then your coverage bias will have to come mostly from those households who you are not able to access because they don't have mobile phones or landlines. it can be a big problem in some countries where the mobile phone use is at low levels. In our case, for instance, in Madagascar, when we did the mix 2 years ago, the mobile phone use ownership was about 49%. Now that's half of the country. In a place like Sierra Leone, I think it was in the 60s. And there are several countries which had 70s, 80s coverage rates. But most of the countries have above 90%. So it's obvious you have to be careful about what you're collecting and how you're analyzing it and how you're presenting the results. There are a number of methods which have been developed over time, which try to allow for, or correct for, or compensate for this kind of coverage, possible coverage biases. Some organizations, for instance, calculate propensity scores to come up with, correction factors or sample weights accordingly. In some cases, in our case, in Mongolia, for instance, we have been trying to compensate for it by doing a Euclidean distance analysis prior to data collection, and trying to pick those households for substitution. Those households which are identical to those households that we haven't been able to access, not only because they don't have mobile phone numbers, but for other reasons, maybe repeated calls to the household which have not been answered. So after that, we try to come up with a substitute on a conditional basis. Conditionality being the household which is the most identical one. So over time, but I do see in the literature now, and as you may know, there's a surge in the number of phone surveys which have been conducted in the last 6-7 months. Let me give you an example. I didn't realize this until we started collecting this data from UNICEF's country offices. UNICEF alone, worldwide, has done about more than 500 phone surveys since April. This is UNICEF alone, and this is an underestimate at this point. I think it's many more. World Bank is active in about 100 countries doing phone surveys, and you name it. I mean, there are private vendors and research organizations and others who have been doing these phone surveys. I see a lot of variability in terms of how the results are presented, how low response plus possible bias is dealt with, how sample weights are calculated, and the language with which the results are being presented. For example, I've seen examples of phone surveys, and these can be random digit dialing surveys. This can be based on simple telephone number lists from private vendors. This can be based on household survey frames, etc. I have seen unfortunately, quite a few examples when the results have been published based on the 50% of the population which provided phone numbers or what they were able to access, with absolutely no warning or no language about what the data represents, with the exception of saying that, for instance, we have found that the sex of the household head is very similar to what we had in a survey 3 years ago, or the educational distribution is quite similar, or the regional distribution is quite similar. Trying to validate as if the results of the survey are really good enough or representative by doing that kind of simple comparisons. I've been seeing quite a few examples when calibration methods are being used by coming up with expansion factors or correction factors for different socioeconomic groups, but doing it univariately, not by calculating propensity scores or anything else, anything sophisticated, anything robust, but coming up with very, very simple analyses of what the sample would represent if it was to be expanded to the structure of the population. And there are those which are done quite professionally, I think, methodologically correctly. So there's a variety of things. If I may, I would like to open a parenthesis here and talk about something else, because what I just explained reminded me of it. I think with the surge of phone surveys, and you see, I am also using the term phone surveys. With this surge, we have a little bit of a terminological confusion right now. We're using the term phone surveys to refer to quite different things. In the case of mixed plus surveys, in the case of the COVID surveys, COVID impact surveys that the World Bank is doing, which is similar to our methodology. In the case of the listening to surveys in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, those surveys. What is happening there in these surveys is that the phones are used as the medium of administration of questionnaires. So we're talking about the phone as a tool which replaces paper or tablets for collecting information. We call these surveys generically, we have been calling them phone surveys. There are other surveys which are, and these are all based on representative household frames, just like a household survey would be. Now, we have also other surveys, right? Like the RDD surveys, the random digit dialing surveys, where you generate randomly generate phone numbers and call households. Your sample frame is a random list of phone numbers based on the system of phone numbers in the country. There are other types of surveys which are based on phone numbers acquired from private companies, private vendors, where you select a sample from and you call those households. Now, all of these examples are generically referred to as phone surveys, which is creating a confusion here, because then that leads into another confusion, which is that the term survey is used sometimes to refer to household surveys only, and sometimes to all kinds of population-based surveys, which might be the type of phone surveys that I gave examples of, like the random digit dialing surveys. So I think we should be very clear in terms of using the word phone, referring to data collection, whether it is being used as a tool or whether it is constituting the starting point or the sample frame of data collection. Those are two very different methodologies, but we seem to be using them or encapsulating them into one single term, which I find a little bit problematic.
Thank you, and thank you for the clarification on terminology. My next question has been partially answered by your discussion earlier. I was going to ask about the data collection tool and how it was compromised using telephones rather than face-to-face interviewing when you started Mix Plus. You already mentioned some questions could not be asked through proxy respondents, such as contraceptive use. So could we basically say individual interviews are not happening in Mix Plus and rather a household interview is happening? Or could you please elaborate on this a little bit?
In the case of, there are others who do individual interviews. I can only talk about Mix Plus. In the case of the two Mix Plus exercises that we have right now in Mongolia and Georgia, in both cases, the questionnaire is administered to any knowledgeable household member. We are not targeting individuals, but we are targeting individuals to collect information from that respondent. In the first wave of calls in Mongolia, for instance, one of the target groups that we had was children 2 to 17, because we were mostly interested in education, in distance learning, which had been put in place in Mongolia, obviously. So we targeted that group. Within the questionnaire, we actually do a random selection of one child per household, 2 to 17, and then ask the questions to the adult household member who is the respondent on that child. So there's individual level information collected. We have to do the distinction there, I think. One is about talking to an individual and trying to get information from that individual about himself or herself. The other is talking to a proxy respondent who may or may not, depending on your questionnaire, give you information on an individual or individuals in the household. This always happens in household surveys, as you know. If your starting point is a household questionnaire, to say the least, you would collect information on demographics when you're constructing the household list from a single respondent. Like in the case of regular mixed surveys or DHS surveys or others, you first construct the household list from which you would select the eligible people, individuals, for individual questionnaires. So in the case of Mongolia and Georgia, yes, we are targeting the adult member, but we are asking, we've been asking questions about individuals in the household. Now, I gave the example of contraception, but there are many others that would not be suitable for phone interviews. There's now abundant literature and recommendations and guidelines out there. For instance, when it comes to topics like domestic violence, sexual abuse, those kinds of things would be quite difficult, if not unethical, in some cases, to ask over phones. That's one. Secondly, thinking of what we are exactly doing in a phone interview as opposed to a household interview, household survey interview. When you have this structured questionnaires, you have plenty of time to ask questions and to get to an indicator that you would create from a set of questions. You would ask a number of questions and probe questions too. And you would use different parts of the questionnaire to really contribute to the construction of an indicator or a tabulation, for instance. Let's remember that in household surveys, the household survey questionnaires tend to be much longer than what we can hope to have in phone interviews. The phone interview, I wouldn't say standard because there's a lot of variability in this too, but I think most experts would agree that you would stretch it a little bit too far if you were to go beyond 20 minutes, for instance, in a phone interview. In Mongolia, the first wave of calls, I was just looking at the results today, we completed in 15.6 minutes on the average, ranging from 12 point something in the capital city to 18 minutes in one of the other regions. So that's more or less the ballpark of what you should be operating in. But when it comes to a household survey, the individual questionnaires can be 40 minutes up to an hour in some cases, depending on the household survey program, of course. So that would put also limitations on what you can ask. How many probe questions you can put in within 15 minutes, and you would always be very eager to collect, good information, complete information on a topic or an indicator when you have the phone survey. Then you would be really economizing on the number of questions that you would ask. That would also bring in some limitations as to the types of topics that you can get to in a phone interview. One thing that I wanted to mention, though, of course, there's this limitation of the length of the phone interview. That's fine. But these longitudinal mixed plus type surveys are giving us another opportunity. which is that we don't need to collect all the information that we want at a single in a single call, in a single wave. In Mongolia, the first wave of calls was mostly focused, I would say, on distance learning and education. The second wave of calls will be mostly focusing on nutrition, diet and nutrition of both women and children, mostly children. So we will alternate. Therefore, you create more space for a topic like distance learning in one wave of calls by not asking questions on another topic, but leaving that topic to the next wave of calls. If, of course, your plan permits it to do it that way.
So, thank you. Let me continue with the common questions to face-to-face and the phone. I mean, the common questions. So are you expecting or maybe observed or tested any measurement differences due to the mode difference or the level of interviewer involvement, maybe because of the lack of nonverbal feedback, or maybe there are some issues, the rapport issues between the respondent and the interviewer?
Good question. I think it's $1 million question too, in some ways. Looking at the literature on this now, I think you can find evidence for both arguments. There are those who are saying that there's good evidence out there that says that if you do things right, obviously, a phone interview would give you probably on a specific set of type of indicators, would give you results which would be comparable to what you would get in a household survey. But there are others, in the literature who say just the opposite, that you shouldn't be expecting to get the same kind of comparable data from a phone based on a phone interview as opposed to a face-to-face interview. Now, from looking at it from the household surveys point of view, that perspective, my background is household surveys mostly. We know that this is something standard that we do in household surveys when we train people and when we talk about household surveys, the methodology, that face-to-face interaction, that rapport that the interviewer builds with the respondents, usually being in a separate place without anybody else's involvement or distraction, structuring a questionnaire from a longish questionnaire, of course, going from the general stuff to more detail, building rapport along the way, and being able to go into more sensitive topics, using the opportunity of being on a one-to-one basis, face-to-face basis. We believe that creates good quality data, don't we? Now, that is completely lost, obviously, on a phone interview. But that doesn't necessarily mean that on a phone interview, you cannot hope to get good, accurate information. I would think that just to say that there are two ways of thought in this, either they're comparable or not comparable, is a little bit far too simplistic in my view. I think it depends on the type of information that you're after, what you're asking, what the indicator is, what the questions are. For some questions, it will not work. For some questions, we know from household surveys, you need that face-to-face interaction. You just need it. But there are other things that maybe we are not doing as well in household surveys as you would do in a phone survey. And that might be not because of the type of questions, but because of other factors. For instance, if you are creating respondent fatigue in a household survey when you are interviewing people for 50 minutes, for an hour, as opposed to a simple phone call where you're asking a very simple factual question to a respondent on the phone, and when it is known that the whole interview is going to be 10-15 minutes, there might be better chances of the respondent giving better quality answers there. So I think it really depends on the context. It really depends on how your questionnaires are designed in the phone interview or in the household questionnaire, in the household survey questionnaire. So it depends on a number of factors. I would be reluctant to to say, no, absolutely they're not comparable, or absolutely they're comparable. I think it depends on the context and the content.
Are breakouts common for telephone interviews in developing countries with respect to your Mixed Plus experience?
In Belize, we had relatively high dropout rates. The biggest dropout in these types of surveys seems to be happening when you go from the household survey itself, the phone numbers or the frame, let's say, to the first call. And there's evidence that we have shown it ourselves inadvertently in Belize, but there's the World Bank surveys which have shown this evidence that the longer the time between the time that you collected the phone numbers and the time that you did the phone interviews, the higher the dropout rates. So the biggest dropout happens the first time, before you have the first call. People you may not be able to find them. They might refuse. They might have forgotten that they gave you your consent before. They might not have understood why you were collecting the phone numbers from them. They might change their mind, etc., etc. The second biggest chunk of dropouts seems to be happening between the first call and the second call. And then from there on, I think the dropout rates are usually lower. At least that's what we are learning from literature. In the case of Belize, we did something inadvertently a mistake, which was that we had a very long time, multiple months, I think 4 months or so, between the time that we did the baseline survey, where we collected the phone numbers, and the first phone calls, because of logistic reasons and because of reasons to do with the contracts or the vendor, etc. And that cost us, let's put it that way. We had a number of households which didn't participate or dropped out very quickly. We'll see in the case of Mongolia and Georgia what will happen. I'm very hopeful that, in Mongolia, we got a response rate without substitution or anything else in excess of 83, 84%, I think, which is an incredible number for a household, for a phone survey. You see, I'm also doing the mistake of of calling it a phone survey without qualifying it. And when we substituted, we went up to 90 something, 95, 96%, I think, which is huge as well. And based on that, I'm hoping that the dropout rates are going to be quite low. But you have to do things right. I think dropout, just like in household surveys, where one of my mottos in household surveys, and when I used to train interviewers in the old days, I would always say that refusals of households in developing countries, of course, mostly, refusals of households is based on two factors. One, the refusal of the households itself, but two, because of the interviewer, because of how you approached the household, how you knocked on the door, how you spoke to the person, how you introduced yourself. Those are very important factors that may increase refusal rates. In the case of in the case of using phone calls to interview people, I think the same applies. It depends on how you are approaching people. If you are challenging people, if you put in place a 45 minutes or 30 minutes, let's say, phone call the first round, then the second round people will think, not really. I spent half an hour with this person. Is this going to go on for a year? That's too long. I don't want to spend half an hour, 45 minutes with these challenging questions, answering these people all the time. And you might cause an increase in the dropout rates. So it depends on you as well. But we hope that in the case of Mongolia and Georgia, we will have a stable participating good set of households without high high dropout rates. That's what we're hoping. We'll see.
Thank you. We are now moving towards questions regarding the future. So I was wondering, what are the plans of mix for countries that had mixed surveys before but did not collect any phone information? For instance, I think you mentioned Mongolia having registration data for phone numbers. Are there any such plans to find alternative frames for phone numbers or anything else?
Well, good question. One of the decisions that we have taken, which COVID has taught us, is to try to collect phone numbers in all the mixed surveys from now on. We learned, interestingly, that although we as a program had not been recommending the collection of phone numbers in our standard questionnaires or in our guidelines, our counterparts, who are the national statistical offices, in many cases, were actually collecting this information themselves, but obviously not sharing with us. In any case, that's confidential information. In the case of Georgia, for instance, in the case of Mongolia Mix 2018 also had phone numbers. But we had nothing to do with those phone numbers ourselves as the mixed program. But we see that in the future, I think there's going to be much more reliance on mixed methods. I'm not saying mixed, but mixed methods. I think there's going to be more reliance on collecting data through phones, through web-based interviews, through face-to-face, etc. I think, and this is not only because of COVID. I think we were going that way as a world, but COVID seems to have accelerated it. UN agencies, for instance, who were not systematically doing phone surveys or commissioning phone surveys or partnering with statistical offices on phone surveys, are not doing it, in large numbers. We have COVID has just caused all of us, all the UN agencies, most of the UN agencies, to be very much thinking along the lines of phone surveys and big data, web-based interviewing. Those kinds of new types of data have gained another type of prominence in the collection of data. And I think going forward, we're all going to be thinking more about mixed methods. Now, is this new thinking? No, it's not new thinking. It precedes COVID. And I think with the so-called data revolution coming in 2014, 15, we started talking more and more about data ecosystems, that no single data source will be able to come up with all the answers that we need. Household surveys will always have the weakness of not producing high resolution data. Qualitative data will never be representative, or big data will have its own weaknesses and strengths. Administrative data, when it is complete, will be a great source of information, but it will have lots of weaknesses when it comes to disaggregation or showing the diversity or the background characteristics of the individuals in the admin system. Censuses will come every 10 years. You're not going to be, the frequency of a census is never going to be good enough. When the census is face-to-face, of course. So we have the recognition, we have had the recognition for a number of years now, that we have to rely on more than one data source. We cannot really solve the problems of the world, understand the world, by using only one type of data source or a few data sources. So that approach to using mixed methods, either within a single data collection effort or thinking about multiple data collection exercises or approaches to build a story altogether and create an ecosystem so that there's a more comprehensive understanding of what's happening out there. I think is something that COVID is interestingly helping us to approach much more faster than we did. The affinity of us, for instance, as UNICEF, to phone surveys have exponentially increased, as I was saying earlier. It will be much less difficult now to get UNICEF into partnerships with others, including the national statistical offices, to collaborate on not only on household surveys or even phone surveys, but other types of data collection efforts too. And that's what I see happening, I think. But we have to make this distinction. I think we are talking about triangulation here to some extent. We're talking about opening our horizon and trying to use different types of data with different types of robustness, representativeness, quality even. We are talking about using different data sources along those dimensions and putting them all together to build a story. That can happen as a mixed method data collection effort. Within the same survey, you might be depending on both face-to-face as well as phone interviews. You might be recruiting your respondents by face-to-face interviews, but continuing to collect data from them on the web. There's going to be all kinds of these data collection efforts, but there's going to be also, and I think I value that a lot as well, we have a separate initiative now in Mix that we are about to embark on, which is called Mix Link, which is from the outset constructing a survey, a mixed survey, to be triangulated with another data source. We have been having negotiations with 2 countries right now to conduct a mixed survey, collect such information, ID information in a mixed survey, so as to be able to link the individuals in the survey, in this case, in the case of these 2 countries, students, children going to schools, to the education system, so that when we finish the survey, we can access, or the National Statistical Office can access the admin system and get information from the admin system and merge onto the mixed data in terms of the type of information which is not available from the mix itself. Another example of this, which is a simple example, it has become so standard that we don't even, we take it for granted. Use of geospatial data is the same too. You geocode your household survey data, and suddenly a horizon opens up. You can come up based on the geocodes of a cluster of a household. You can come up with lots of covariates that have to do with climate, that have to do with pollution, that have to do with anything which is available geocoded. And that's a type of triangulation too, or merging data too. And that's what we intend to do in Mixed Link. I think this thinking of merging different type of data is really close to my heart. I think that's something that we are going to be putting more and more emphasis on in the Mix program.
We know that Mix collects anthropometric data from children, which provide key indicators of childhood malnutrition. So what would you recommend for the collection of such data under COVID conditions? Do you think the flow of this data will stop until the end of the pandemic, or will there be any alternatives?
Well, it's going on actually. In the 2 surveys that we did, we both resumed, both Malawi and Turks and Caicos, we had anthropometry, as we have almost in all mixed surveys, I would say. Maybe there's a couple of exceptions here and there. We did continue to collect anthropometric data in those surveys, and there's no strong evidence that we had, we had resistance from the households. But this is June, July. Now it's the population see COVID as a different thing. probably. The second wave is coming in, has come in a number of countries. I think populations are much more aware everywhere about COVID and the risks involved. And I think you're absolutely right in pointing out to the specific topic of anthropometry. And that has been a challenge for us. We're about to come up with guidelines on safety recommendations, safety precautions that should be put in place as recommendations from our side. Of course, the ultimate decision is always with the government who do these surveys, but we are coming up with a series of recommendations on this, on how to deal with face-to-face interaction, what to do in the venue where you're providing the training, how to use PPE, how to use masks, when to use masks, what happens if somebody is positive, all those kinds of recommendations. And there's an ongoing dialogue among different survey programs as well on this. But specifically to your question, from the outset, when we started thinking about what is going to happen in surveys when we go back to face-to-face, specifically about mix, we started thinking about anthropometry, because that's one of the two times that we have to be very close, if not interacting physically with the respondent or the household member. One is anthropometry, and the other, in our case, is when we apply the foundational learning skills module, where the interviewer has to sit next to the child, exchange material, where we are testing the numeracy and literacy skills of the child. Those are two key points for us. For anthropometry, I would say that the actual measurement during data collection is we are seeing it as less of a problem, because certain precautions can be put in place. Then training. As you know, we do validation during training. We use children measured by different measures at the same time, where the child goes from one station to the other or vice versa. That is proving to be more of a challenge that we have been putting our thinking into. We haven't really resolved it ourselves. There has been some thinking along those lines with regard to the number of the extent of this validation, with regard to using dolls instead of real children during training. But one of the pieces of news that I wanted to give you is that the nutrition surveys, there's a survey program called Smart Surveys. You may have heard of. They have come up with a set of recommendations. They work very closely with CDC, the Center for Disease Control. They have come up with a set of recommendations and a guideline on how to do nutrition surveys, and there's plenty of information on how to deal with these things in that publication, which has just come out. I think we're going to be incorporating some of those recommendations into ours, but we have to come up with specific recommendations as they apply to the content of mix, obviously.
Thank you. From a global point of view, what type of survey errors are going to be mostly discussed in survey literature from today onwards, with the abandonment of face-to-face surveys? I mean, at least temporary abandonment of face-to-face surveys.
Thanks. I think I have a more optimistic view of what's going to happen than most. I think there was a survey back in August by the World Bank and the Statistics Division of UN. It was a survey of all the national statistics offices around the world. And one of the questions to the statistical offices was, when do you expect to go back to face-to-face activities, face-to-face data collection? And in that survey, close to half of the statistical officers said within the next 6 months. The remaining 50% were saying that they were uncertain, basically. Now, of course, this is August. That was August. Now we're in November. The second wave has come in. There are certain parts of the world which have not been as affected as others, and things are going to develop. There's the vaccine on the horizon, so there's still a lot of uncertainty. But I do see, and in the case of mixed, for instance, we have a few surveys which are about to go to the field. We have quite a few surveys which are planned for January, February. So I am of the view that just like we ourselves in our normal daily social lives have adapted and changed certain behavior, but still are trying to cope with the challenges and continue life as much as possible as normal, I think face-to-face surveys are going to come back. And once this is over, hopefully it's going to be over sometime. Nobody knows when. Not immediately, of course. I think we're going to go back to what will be the new normal there. Now, what will be the new normal? How will households react to face-to-face interviewing? Is this going to influence response rates, completion rates in countries? That remains to be seen. I don't think anyone has a very clear idea on what's going to happen there. But I think there's going to be much more reliance on types of data which are not going to be necessarily representative in the way that the statistical establishment has understood it always. The statistical establishment has been very much fixated, and quite rightly, on representativeness, on probabilities of selection, on full completion, full coverage, as much as possible, the avoidance of bias, at least intentional bias, etc. But the new data sources which are coming in are not going to have those kinds of ambitions or claims. A phone survey based on RDD will say that 30% of this country doesn't have phone numbers, so we are doing this on the basis of the 70%. There's going to be much more in terms of participatory data collection. Like UNICEF runs a number of projects in different countries where adolescents enroll on these kinds of surveys. It's a feedback process sometimes, and the data is collected, and the results are published. They do polling of adolescents. Now, in those cases, it's an intentional participation on the part of the respondent. Obviously, it's not representative, but it's very useful, very valuable data. So I think that's what we are going to be increasingly more and more looking into, that kind of coverage, bias, usefulness, utility, what data is fit for what purpose, those kinds of things, mixed methods, triangulating data, increasing use of technology in all kinds of data collection, digitization of almost everything, everywhere, I think. And that's going to accelerate probably from now on. So those are the things which are coming up, I think, among many others, of course.
Thank you. We have already heard your views about this data ecosystem and digitalization, but I'm going to go ahead and ask just in case you have anything else to add. So use of non-survey data, big data, or organic data has been increasing rapidly over the years, such as Google search data, Twitter hashtags, Google mobility data, and the like. And with the pandemic, we are seeing different ways such data is exploited to shed light on human behavior. How do you think studies of this kind will affect survey data collection in the future? Will it serve as a replacement to surveys, or will it complement them, or are there any specific pitfalls you would like to underline?
At least for the time being, for the foreseeable future, I don't think we are, and I'm approaching this from a methodological perspective. I'm not talking about practice. Practice is something else. From a methodological perspective, I don't think those initiatives themselves are even talking about replacing the traditional ways of collecting data. No, nobody is saying that right now. Nobody is claiming that. Everybody is saying that these fit into the different places in the data ecosystem. They complement each other rather than replacing each other. Actually, you probably know that much of the analysis, which is produced on the basis of Facebook data or Google data, remote sensing, satellite imagery, etc., they use population census data or household survey data or admin data to a large extent to come up with models in terms of making their data, the results, more robust. So there's dependency on these, on each other, actually. That's one of the many reasons why these are going to remain to be complementary. That's one. But that's the methodological part of it. The other part of it is practice. The other approach to this could be looking at it from a practice point of view. Whether the cheaper or more inexpensive alternative ways of collecting data, which are not necessarily as robust because of resource limitations, are going to be causing less resources to go to more expensive but more robust data collection efforts, such as household surveys or censuses. Whether that's going to happen remains to be seen. I don't think it would be a good idea if that happens. I hope it doesn't. But there's an attractiveness to the new types of data. They're fast, they're faster, they're cheaper, they're not as robust. That's fine. So if resources are mostly channeled to those types of data only, and as a result, other types of traditional robust data collection instruments suffer from it, in practice, there's going to be something close to a replacement, maybe. I hope it doesn't that way, because methodologically, it's not justified at all at this point. But 30 years from now, will we be doing face-to-face interviews and household surveys in the same way that we are doing? Well, almost certainly not. We have seen, if we were having this discussion 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we would be talking about 20%, 25% of populations having phones. Doing anything on the phone, any kind of interaction with respondents on the phone would be unthinkable. Now we are discussing whether the RDD surveys or how the RDD surveys can be methodologically made to be representative. So 30 years from now, I think we're going to be looking at a very different world in that case. Maybe we moved from paper to CAPI, as you know. In the case of Mix, we don't have paper-based questionnaires anymore. All our surveys are tablet-based. And we moved into tablet within a couple of years. We took the decision, and within a couple of years, all our surveys were based on tablets. Maybe 30 years from now, we are not going to be thinking about tablets at all. Maybe phones are going to be the standard. Maybe web is going to be the standard. I think it's really important to concentrate on today and innovate as much as possible and see what happens, rather than fantasizing about 30 years from now, because the world is, in terms of communication and IT technologies, the world is changing so fast that it is quite difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen in 30 years from now.
Thank you. Actually, we come our last question, and I'm speaking. You already answered my question with regards to Yasser's and Tuğba's question, but maybe you have some last word to say on it. So this is actually a common question that we're asking to all experts that we have interviewed. So let's assume that the COVID-19 is eradicated overnight. So do you think surveys can go back to pre-COVID era instantly? Or, as you already mentioned, what are the challenges do you think we should be expecting after the pandemic is eradicated?
Well, your question started with a shall I call it hypothetical or a science fiction assumption, which is that COVID is going to be eradicated overnight. It's not going to happen, obviously. But let's think of a scenario when COVID is going to be normal over a period of time. The vaccines are going to be widespread. It's going to be rolled out everywhere, etc. Let's think of that situation. Let's think of a situation where we have the new normal, and I think we are all accepting worldwide that once the COVID is over, it's not going back to normal. It's going to be going to a new normal. The new normal is going to be different from the previous normal. Obviously, in every aspect of life. Now, coming to household surveys, we are already doing changes. As I mentioned earlier, because of COVID, we have decided we should collect phone number information in all the surveys. We should be prepared for that kind of thing. We should be collecting phone numbers in preparation for mixed plus surveys in all the countries too, if the country wants to go about it. I think we ourselves, as a household survey program, have been thinking more about collecting more frequent data. And one way that we have committed ourselves to doing so is Mix Plus. It's not going to be implemented everywhere, obviously, but in countries who are interested in this, we will be providing an opportunity post-COVID to countries to go in and collect this data, because one of the pessimistic views, of course, as you know, is that this is not the first and last pandemic. There's going to be similar pandemics or epidemics later. So we have to be prepared for those kinds of eventualities, I think. We have to think, I'm going back to what I said earlier, we have to think of mixed methods. We have to be more cognizant of the fact that we have to rely on different types of data in different types of circumstances. And each of them will have their weaknesses and strengths, but each of them will complement each other. So we have to have a wider look at what's going to happen and how we are going to be collecting data. Household surveys, are they going to change? I think so. We don't know what the behavior of the households are going to be once the COVID is over. Are we going to be suffering from much higher completion rate, much lower completion rates, much lower response rates? Is that what's going to happen? Are households going to be more reluctant to open their doors to strangers? Remains to be seen. Most probably there will be elements of that. I do think that in our daily lives there are going to be behavioral changes as a result of this. I think we have been fast educated during this pandemic on a number of things that have to do with face-to-face or human interaction, which will leave its traces on, I think, ourselves. So household surveys will change as well. We'll try to keep we should try to keep the robustness of household surveys, of course, in the future, because they're the golden standard when it comes to a number of types of data that can be collected, the disaggregation dimension, the socioeconomic disaggregation dimension, being able to come up with both factual data and attitudinal data and behavioral data all at the same time. These are great strengths of a household survey. We have weaknesses, of course, as we know, too. But we have to keep those strengths in place and move forward. And I have no doubt that we are going to be more and more technologically minded. I think one of the things that COVID has taught all of the survey programs, as far as I can see, us included, of course, is that we have to rely more and use more, more technological gadgets and possibilities, and try not to be as perfectionist and as rigid in our thinking as possible. I think that's really, really important too.
This actually marks the end of our interview. I would like to ask my colleagues if they have any other questions for Dr. Hancıoğlu.
No, I
No,
just,
I don't.
Okay.
thank him. So I believe that we learned many things from I believe, a global perspective. And as he is leading one of the largest global household surveys, we learned too much about the reaction to COVID and also the perspective to during COVID and post-COVID the era. So I thank him very much.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting. We would like to once again thank Dr. Attila Hancıoğlu, the coordinator of the mixed surveys, for his valuable time and discussion with us today. So have a great day.
Thank you very much.